Well, welcome everyone to another one of our CERIAS seminars on a Wednesday afternoon. And we're very pleased to welcome Sam Visner to speak today. His bio is on the website he provided us, and I'm not going to go over all the various things that he put in there because Sam has played major senior roles in a number of organizations, all related to cybersecurity. Most recently, he's been at the MITRE Corporation, and MITRE is a longtime friend and collaborator with CERIAS. He's worked there on a number of different things, including as director of the National Cybersecurity FFRDC with NIST in the Maryland area. Most recently, he's now the chair of the board of directors of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center. That's the Space ISAC. And Purdue is also involved in the Space ISAC. Sam is going to talk to us about the evolution of cyberspace, competing ideologies of cybersecurity. And this is in line with a couple other talks that we've had so far this semester. When he's done, or as he's going along, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat, because we're not going to be going to the chat. That's for information that you may have for those of us who are running this. Questions go in the Q&A, and answers will come from Mr. Visner. So, Sam, please take it away, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much, Spaff. It's an honor to have a few minutes today to talk with this particular audience, and that the invitation came from Spaff is a double honor. He really is a legend in the cybersecurity and national security community. Frankly, there's nothing I can say that he wouldn't say better, and no thought that I have that he wouldn't make smarter. So I know that I have to be on my best, I'm on my very best behavior. I want to give a disclaimer here, if I can now, and that disclaimer is that although I work for MITRE and I'm an adjunct at Georgetown, and I'm the vice chair of the board of directors of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, everything I say is my opinion. Others may or may not share these views, but they are not necessarily the views of anybody for whom I work. If you hear something you like, that's great. And if you hear something you don't like, or to which you take objection, you may certainly do so, but don't blame MITRE, don't blame the Space ISAC, don't blame Georgetown, don't blame my wife, and don't blame the fish in our aquarium. It's all my fault. Very good. Now, I've had rather an interesting journey, and therefore I cannot and do not pitch myself as a professional academic. In fact, I'm not. I've done all sorts of things. My late mother despaired, and I think correctly, that I would never be able to hold a job. And if you take a look at this list, I started life, well, after Georgetown as an undergrad as a CIA officer. I then went into business. I then got called back as a government executive at NSA as chief of signals intelligence programs. All in the middle of all of this, I became an adjunct professor. Then I became at Georgetown. Then I became a businessman again. Then I found myself running a couple of cybersecurity businesses. And then I became the director of a federally funded research and development center. And then I became a MITRE Tech Fellow. And now, of course, I'm with the Space ISAC. So I've had this long, rather interesting zigzag of a journey. And my viewpoint is formed by this journey. It's not formed by rigorous empirical academic study. I'm not a grand theorist. I do not pretend that I have an empirical method that informs what I'm going to tell you. It just seems right to me. And that's all I can do. What I want to try to do today in the next 30, 40 minutes or so is tell you 5 stories. And the 5 stories to me are sort of interesting because they're interrelated. And when we talk about cybersecurity today, we talk about it as if it's always existed, or we talk about it as if we all know what it is. But that's not true. Cybersecurity as it exists today is a relatively new concept because it exists in a place that's relatively new, called cyberspace. And cyberspace itself came into existence because of a revolution in information technology. So all of these things have been happening, more or less in parallel. A revolution in IT, which created the digital cyberspace that we know today, which created cybersecurity, which has in fact got several different and rather interesting and really different definitions, which has created different concepts in different concepts of sovereignty, the idea of where a nation state is sovereign and where it's not. We didn't used to think of cyberspace as a sovereign place. And if a place can be sovereign, how is it going to be governed? And to get a sense of how all this happened, Spaff is, well, you're probably a little younger than I am, but in the course of one human lifetime, in the course of my lifetime, and not just in the course of my lifetime, but in the course of my professional lifetime, which is somewhat shorter than my whole life, I've moved from the first information technology on which I was formally trained, Morse code, to the iPhone in one professional lifetime, from Morse code to the iPhone. Think about the trajectory and the velocity that takes place along that trajectory. Now, when we talk about cybersecurity, and this is sort of a spoiler alert, and I'm sorry about that, but I'm not all that sorry about it, but it's obligatory to say you're sorry sometimes, right? A lot of people say it's about safeguarding information. Some people take a somewhat more expansive view. I'm among them, and we say it's not just the information, but it's the systems that process it. And then there are those people who say it's not just that, but in a world of IoT devices and infrastructures that depend on those systems, cybersecurity is about protecting and safeguarding the infrastructures that depend on the computers that process that information. That's what many people think of as cybersecurity. And it's a good sort of working, everyday definition. But there are those who say that cybersecurity is a little broader, that there's a place called cyberspace, and it's about gaining the outcome you want and not letting somebody else gain an outcome they want at your expense. And lastly, and I think from this conversation, maybe most important, is that cyberspace is seen by some countries as sovereign, just like the streets of Detroit or the streets of Austin, Texas, or the streets of Cape Cod. And that cybersecurity is not about protecting information, it's about governing what human beings do in this new sovereign space, just like a physical space. That's very different. That's very different from talking about cybersecurity as protecting information. And we're going to talk about how we got to the point where these two trains have diverged and parted company. So we're going to talk about how we made this transition. Now, when we talk about cyberspace, we tend to think about cybersecurity from a very traditional point of view. And from anybody who's been exposed to our good friends at the Department of Defense and in the intelligence community, we say cybersecurity consists of three things: computer network defense, keeping people out; computer network exploitation, getting in and stealing information; or computer network attack, damaging that information or altering it so that it no longer has integrity, or maybe damaging an information system, which happened with Aramco, or even damaging an infrastructure that's controlled by information systems like Stuxnet. So you see the terms defense, exploitation, and attack. But I want you to forget you're seeing those words and think for a moment about the word computer network, because the concept of cyberspace in which we conduct cybersecurity is important. It's important to understand the term computer network, because the integrated computer network of today are the pillars, are the architectural structures that comprise cyberspace. And they're relatively new. They didn't exist 50 years ago to any great extent. They're just coming into existence. And just to give you a sense of how fast this was, we've gone from World War II, which was a modern war, land, sea, air, submarines, culminating in the use of nuclear weapons, to point-to-point communications, all the way to automatic switching systems, to data warehouses, to virtualization, to 5G, internet, to the convergence of 5G, to having billions of internet protocol addresses, and throwing off so much information that we're going to use AI to analyze it and to manage our infrastructures, our roads and our power and our water. We've done this essentially in the period of a human lifetime. There are people alive today who were alive in 1945 and have witnessed all of it. And if you think that they've had some, if you think it can be difficult to encompass all of this, think about a human being having to learn an entirely new way of operating in terms of communication. Let me talk a little bit more about how this came from. When we think about the cyberspace that exists today, what made it possible? Where did it come from? Well, it really got its start, in the 1920s and 1930s with information theory, with people who said it would be possible to code information digitally. People like Claude Shannon and Nystrom and others who developed information theory and the concepts of information entropy. But we didn't have the technology to do it. What happened starting in the 1950s, accelerating into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, was that we developed the technology. We had the theoretical construct, but we didn't know how to do it. We also had to drive costs down, and we did. And we've driven it down today so that you can have a device like this little iPhone here that has more processing power than the entire world possessed in 1945. We had to make sure everybody had access to it. We made it ubiquitous. We had to make sure things were interoperable so that when Spaff buys a new printer, he can hook it up to his network and hook it up to his computer or his iPhone or his iPad. I remember years ago, that was hand-to-hand combat. You don't have to go through that now. A big thing we had to do, and this is one of the most important factors in the creation of cyberspace, and therefore the creation of cybersecurity, was the unification of information at motion and information at rest. And that sounds sort of esoteric, but let me put it to you this way. Information in motion is transactional information. You make a phone call, you talk, that's information in motion, or you send a telegraph while that information is being transmitted, or an email, that's information in motion. And we learned how to move that around electronically in the Revolutionary War, where we had telegraphs. If you've seen the movie, and I hope you do, Lincoln, during the Battle of Gettysburg, in his command center at the White House, it looks like a modern command center. All right, it's wood paneled, and you don't have big LCD displays or big LEDs, but what you do have are operator after operator on identical carols sending and receiving information from the battlefield and to the battlefield and advising the president. What they didn't have was a way of recording this information digitally in a referential database. And the idea, think about it this way. You go to a bank, a few we're doing this less frequently, and you stick your card into the ATM and there's transactional information in motion. It reads your card. You tell it how much money you want to take out. It takes that information and beats it against a referential database. How much money does Spaff have here? If we take that money out, we decrement that database. And that database is available throughout the bank's information system. We didn't have the means to do that really until the late 1950s and early 1960s. The creation of an integrated computer network that could bring those two things together created the basic building blocks of cyberspace, and it didn't exist until really the late 50s and early 60s, and there weren't many of them. There's one other big thing that happened, by the way, and I'll raise it just briefly, and that is a change in the regulatory environment. Prior to the 1980s, there was one big darn phone system in this country, and it was run by Ma Bell or AT&T. And their motto, of course, was, let's reach out and touch somebody. Very touching motto. But they were, in fact, a regulated monopoly. The US government had agreed and settled an antitrust suit with them some 60 years before, in which they were allowed to run as a regulated monopoly, in return for which they would have a regulated rate of return, and they had to make available some very cheap phone service for even poor people in the country. and let the government have eminent domain over that network if there was a national emergency, and in return for which they built an interoperable system. But that system was resistant to change. It was largely analog. Most of the time when you made a phone call, you turned a dial or pushed a button which created tones which caused a switch to literally move up, and these are big crossbar switches, to actually move by a certain number of impulses or a certain number of stops along that switch. If you dialed 4659862, this thing moved over four spaces, and then the next switch 6 spaces, and the next switch 5 spaces. And the idea that we would need enough bandwidth for video calls, AT&T didn't really care for that. They said, look, we don't see any demand for it. In 1982, a company called MCI showed up. You may have heard of them. Certainly your others in your family, your parents would have. And they wanted to put in place a long distance communications network for truckers in the Midwest. And they wanted to lease some of that capability from AT&T. AT&T said, we have a monopoly on this. The government agreed. And AT&T said, and we've lived up to that. So, we'll see you in court. And Bill McGowan, running MCI at the time, said, you bet you will. And he did. Some of you may remember this. He went to court and he said, look, AT&T's monopoly relies on them actually producing telecoms at a cost so low that competition wouldn't lower it, that the marginal cost of the next unit of telephony wouldn't go down if there was competition. And he said, as it happens, I can buy some of their bandwidth and resell it at a lower price than they're charging the market, and I can still make a profit. So clearly, they're not selling telephony at such a low competitive cost. Judge Harold Green brought down his gavel. I recommend a book called Deal of the Century by Stephen Cole, The Breakup of AT&T. And when he did, AT&T's big black phone exploded. The company was broken up. They had to divest the local phone companies and allow competition in the market. That competition began to fulfill the heretofore unsatisfied demand for digital services. And that's another reason why, although the technology existed, there had been a roadblock to its adoption. And that's not a story that people tend to tell, because it's not a story principally about technology. It's a story about human competition. Now, some aspects of cybersecurity in terms of just intercepting and safeguarding communications have been around for a long, long time. For example, we used electronic communications during the U.S. Civil War, and it was that plus the North's enormously bigger population and industrial capacity helped them to win. They were not only able to send their forces by railroad from one front to the other, but they had a network of telephony of communications that allowed information to flow. And at best, you might try to chop down some of those cables or intercept them or break the simple codes at the time. But this really wasn't cybersecurity as we practice it today. In World War I, things got a little more sophisticated. Codes got a little better. There was a lot more communication taking place. The term hacking reportedly, and this is an apocryphal story, may not be true, comes from, according to the story, British frogmen who swam ashore and cut the cables the Germans were using to communicate with their embassies overseas, and they cut them by using hatchets. They hacked through them. World War II saw the first efforts to start to build really integrated information systems, but those efforts were hobbled because we didn't have the digital technology necessary to actually unify information in motion and information at rest. So you might have operators saying, we're tracking this plane on radar, we're tracking, the British are coming to bomb Britain, or the British or the Americans are going to bomb Berlin. And people were seeing this and taking that information and writing it down on big transparent boards with grease pencils. That was the information at rest. And as long as there wasn't too much information, you could actually process that information in something close to real time. But that wouldn't happen, and I'm going to tell you what the challenge was. By the way, in the Second World War, Germany thought that their cybersecurity was pretty darn good. They had a machine called Enigma. You've probably heard of it. Their ability to communicate securely meant that they could send their submarines after Allied convoys. We didn't know where they were, but we did learn how to break it. And by the way, right within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, we had Midway because in part we broke some of the Japanese codes, which changed the course of the war. So interest in code breaking, not necessarily cybersecurity as we practice it today, is not new. By the way, this is how the British attacked the German codes. They came up with a bunch of logic tests. They said, yes, but this is still a hard problem. So let's make it easier. And they studied what the Germans were doing, and they realized, everybody makes mistakes. If the Germans are using this machine, they may make mistakes. If we were using it, we would. What would we make mistakes? And they found out that the Germans were repeating some settings that they should have changed each day, including the 3 letters at the beginning of each day's transmission. They should have changed it every day. Some operators use their girlfriend's name. They kept it. One operator's girlfriend's name was Celia. That became known as an operator's seal, and they would keep it. And so the British began to reduce somewhat the number of possible settings of that machine. But that having made the problem a little easier, it was still hard. So they said, now that we know a little more about it, and we have the means to guess it, let's industrialize the process of intelligent guessing. And they produced a guessing machine, a big mechanical machine called the bomb. And then they produced a few hundred of them and a few thousand of them. And in essence, they industrialized the concept of making guesses, something the Germans never thought would happen. At the end of the war, by the way, a version of this machine as an actual programmable computer was created. This was what the British created to go after the Germans' 12-rotor Enigma machine, the machine used by Hitler to communicate with his principal subordinates. And this machine, which had a rate of data ingress of 50 kilobits in 1945, which was pretty amazing. When you think about the dial-up modems some of us put to sleep 20 years ago that had 56 kilobits, this machine has been recreated, and the story goes that it cracked the German cipher, Hitler's cipher, the first time it was used. Quite a machine. We were also trying to protect information. This is how Roosevelt and Churchill talked to each other. Roosevelt would speak. His voice was coded with analog technology and pulse width modulation. The sound of mercury vapor lamps sparking and arcing and hissing was recorded on records. You can see them in this picture. As he spoke, his voice was coded in modulo arithmetic. The sound of the record was coded in modulo arithmetic. Those noises were added together and transmitted by high-frequency radio over the Atlantic. An identical record playing at the identical speed with some kind of out-of-band synchronization without any digital technology was playing on the other end. And that modulo arithmetic stream of that record, that mercury lamp arcing and sparking and hissing, was subtracted. And from that emerged Roosevelt's voice. This took rooms of equipment. It wasn't cheap. It wasn't interoperable. It wasn't digital. It shouldn't have worked at all. It worked actually quite well, and the Germans were never able to figure out what it was and intercept and break any of Roosevelt and Churchill's communications. However, they both spoke their own form of English, which probably led to its own kind of coded miscommunication. These systems weren't cheap. They weren't ubiquitous. They weren't digital, and they did not process information at rest. Didn't do it. Where did all that come from? It started in the 1950s when we began to come up with the high-speed interoperable digital communications that could create a modern computer network. And we didn't have cyberspace until we did this. We came up with a very unsexy name called the semi-automatic ground environment. This being Washington, we had to come up with a name that would be so boring no one would pay the slightest attention to it. And if somebody said, hey, if you asked your spy, do they have information? Yeah, I have something about the ground environment. They're like, well, go get something important. But this was actually built to automate the air defense of North America. And it was important because we had to be able to keep adversaries from exploiting it, getting into it, and disrupting it. And it was really important because for the first time, we were able, in one digital environment, to combine information in motion and information at rest. Here's what it looked like. Now, I'm really sorry that it's my graphics are not better, and I'm not quite the PowerPoint ninja that some of you are probably used to. But I want you to think about this a little bit as if you were using Waze or Google Maps. And notice that the two images are conceptually pretty much the same. Waze, a picture, a screenshot of which here is, of course, in color. It's not monochrome, whereas Sage was. But let me tell you what a Sage operator would see. They would see a digital map. In other words, they would see a visual representation of a database. And on that database were points that had the names of places and the resources, Malmstrom Air Force Base, and what units were there and how many people were in this city. And if that information was changed, it would be changed in that database and changed in the representation on this map. The other thing you would see on this map is things that were moving around, representing information in motion. And that information in motion would be Soviet bombers and missiles moving at hundreds or perhaps thousands of miles an hour, and American bombers and American fighter planes firing their own missiles moving at thousands of miles an hour. Now, ask yourself how you would have handled this in a world of information at rest. You know, if you were an operator, right? You couldn't possibly put this on a transparent board with a grease pencil and somebody says, all right, the Soviet fighter plane is over here. No, they're over here. You know, this plane is moving at 1,200 miles an hour, or some missile is coming over and it's moving at 3,000 or 4,000 miles an hour. You couldn't possibly keep up with that information in motion and create a physical database with your pen and pencil on a paper or on a plastic board. No, you needed to have a referential database. And this was, as much as anything else, really the world's first large-scale integrated computer network that unified information at motion with information at rest. And this really was the first building block of the thing that we today call cyberspace. Cyberspace didn't exist until this thing and the things that followed it started to exist. Things moved pretty quickly after that. The Defense Advanced Research Project Agency said, well, let's build a network using this kind of technology. And they came up with an interoperable protocol for communications called the Telecommunications Protocol, Internet Protocol, TCP/IP. It's still in use. We had 4 nodes connected by 1969. By 1973, we actually hooked up Europe. And this technology, this architecture of interoperability, pioneered here, became sort of the foundation of what was ARPANET. And ARPANET's architecture is what we know today essentially as the internet. And it's not just communication, but it's a network that connects information the information that's processed both in motion and at rest. And this moved very, very quickly. These kinds of architectures were either deployed publicly or deployed behind the firewall, as it were, or behind the fence line for the Defense Department and other sensitive organizations. And it became so ubiquitous that the Department of Defense didn't have to run it anymore. And therefore, it was finally retired as the internet itself went public. Vint Cerf of Google, one of the inventors of all of this, said it was the first and being first was best. But now we lay it down to ever rest. Now pause with me a moment, shed some tears for old lang syne for love, for years and years of faithful service, duty done, I weep. Lay down thy packet now, O friend, and sleep. And as the ARPANET was essentially retired, the internet was born and cyberspace expanded enormously. Now, a key point here. The creation of cyberspace was the transition from communications to integrated computer networks. And these networks really are the core of today's global cyberspace environment. Now, one of the questions one has to ask is, how big is cyberspace and is it really a human domain? There is a famous capitalist philosopher named Vladimir Lenin. You may have heard of him. And he had a phrase. He once said, quantity has a quality all its own. So cyberspace, I think of, really is a domain. We used to have a few hundred people or a few thousand people connected by telegraphs. When the Titanic sank, the people on that ship were served essentially by one telegraphic link. We have about 7.5, now about 7.6 billion people on Earth. Some tens of millions are on the ocean at any different times. In 2017, the last year for which I have data, we had about 1 billion airline passengers in the world. And, we have maybe 10 or so people up in space at any given moment, although Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are doing whatever they can to get more people up there. And if you have a few dollars of your own, you can, and the doctor's waiver, you can buy a ticket. How many people are in cyberspace? Well, here's some information that comes out of 2017. And it's interesting here because it not only shows you the country's population at the time, but the number of people connected. That's the internet penetration rate. And how much that rate grew from the year 2000 to the year 2017. China, which started essentially at 0, had by 2017 almost 740,000 people online, or over 3,000% rate of growth from 2000 to 2017. The United States had about 200% growth because we had more people online. But you should note that China now has more people online than we have people. By the middle of 2017, more than half of the people in the world were connected. More than half of the people in the world connected. And a year later, it was 55%. Now, what I'm trying to do here is to draw out for you the different experience that we had in coming online and China had in coming online. And that difference shapes, in my opinion, to a very large extent, that experience, how we view cybersecurity, cyberspace and cybersecurity, and how they view it. Our accession into cyberspace was relatively slow. I mean, it was relatively slow, right? About 200% from 2000 to 2017. China moved from essentially nobody to almost 740,000 people in 17 years. In other words, we experienced the development of cyberspace through the incremental advance of technology. They experienced cyberspace through a wave of human beings coming online. So many human beings that they have more human beings online than we have human beings in our country. Here's another way of looking at it. The United States has a population today of about 328 million people. China had as many people online as we have people in 2009. By 2018, they had about 800 million. Today, they have about 1 billion people, or roughly 3 times as many people online out of 1.4 billion people than we have in the United States. We have about 328 million people, most but not all are online. They have about 1 billion people online. So their experience in cyberspace is very different. And we experience cyberspace in the context of a global commons as a liberal democracy. They've experienced their wave of human beings coming online in the context of an authoritarian ideology, which is very different, which requires a closer supervision and level of governance of human beings. And all of a sudden, look, there's a new place where human beings exist. What are we going to do about that? Now, we're not, by the way, the only countries that have our own view. Iran is learning to master cyberspace technologies, and they're very much like China. Our friends in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or also known as North Korea, they're also becoming effective in the use of cybersecurity tools. There are actually attempts underway and a fairly complex calculation that I'm sure you engineers will master by the time this meeting is over, in which we're actually trying to figure out which countries have mastered the ability to exercise cybersecurity, to exercise influence in cyberspace. These are the factors that the Belfer Center at Harvard thinks of as important. I think I'm going to leave you with these slides. I won't try to go through all of it, and besides which, I want to leave a little time for Q&A. But based on this calculus, They said that the United States has the most capability, but the country that has the most highly integrated doctrine and concepts for using capability is China. This is an interesting list. Your own results may be different, and it's already probably about a year and a half out of date, but it provides an interesting snapshot of the capability that countries have. What it doesn't tell you is how countries look at cyberspace. And what's interesting here is that China has a very integrated view of cyberspace and the use of power in cyberspace that may be stronger than ours. Why? Well, let's go back to this picture. With 1 billion people in cyberspace, they probably need the means in their own minds to figure out how cyberspace governance, which for them is cybersecurity, takes place. So for us, cyberspace evolved as an electromagnetic domain. It was driven by technology. It was built by information and integrated computer networks. And these networks serve us as a liberal democracy. For other countries, for authoritarian countries, cyberspace evolved more quickly, and it evolved with such numbers that their people live there and they are sought and they seek to govern them there. That's a very different way of looking at it. I'm going to jump through this for a second and go to another way of looking at this. China, Russia, and several other countries have signed a thing called the Shanghai Cooperation Accord. This is how they define cybersecurity. It's protection against the distribution of information harmful to political and social and economic systems. Do you see anything here about the protection of information? It's about the protection against information. It's about how people are governed, how people behave. This is where cybersecurity has gone for authoritarian countries. And this is very different because what it means is for the global cybersecurity domain, some countries see it as we do, a global commons for free expression, and other countries see it as a domain that can be made sovereign to them. Let me bring this sort of on, let me sort of bring it around and make it a little more tangible. You can see that Chinese researchers have started to talk about cyber territory and defending cyber sovereignty. You're seeing China's approach described as, quote, a state-centric model of internet governance. It favors the authority of the nation state over its netizen. So there are other ways of looking at this. My friend Joe Nye, Spaff, I think you probably know Joe very well, up at Columbia, says that the evolution of cyberspace also ought to be viewed in different levels. There's the level at which the United States is still probably the most powerful country and probably will remain that way. The use of information technology for command, for control, for intelligence, for war making. But at the second level on Mr. Spock's 3-level chessboard, for those who remember it, information technology isn't just used for military power. It's used in a multipolar world of commerce. And the barriers to entry for using advanced information technology are easily surmounted by middle-range powers. And therefore, it's not just the United States, it's the US, it's China, Japan, the European Union, India, Russia, although the situation in Russia is clearly very unsettled. The third level is where IT connects everybody because it's cheap and ubiquitous. No one's dominant. There are very few barriers to entry. We now have close to 60% of the world's people are online. It connects parties and churches, religious affiliations, social groups, ideologies, constituencies, hobbyists. And to be successful there, it's not having the most powerful information technology. It's who has the best story. And you're seeing this played out. You're seeing in attempts to govern cyberspace, which is another definition of cybersecurity now, it's not just based on the technology, it's the use of social media and other tools to create a story that sells. And what Joe Nye has said is that the United States was slow to recognize that the second and third levels even existed, and that what happened at the third level could actually be important, if not decisive. And we were slow to realize that. I think Nye is correct. So in my view, it's the term cybersecurity, which we used to call computer network exploitation, defense, computer network exploitation, and computer network attack, is really now, I would call it computer network control. I would say it's not just defending or attacking, it's constantly defending, constantly exploiting, constantly attacking. It's essentially gaining as much influence as you can in cyberspace so that you are protecting your interests. It's not just I kept you out of my firewall or I got into yours. It's a constant ebb and flow of influence. So in my view, the next term for cybersecurity might well be called computer network control. I'm going to wrap this up with a picture or two and then open it up for Q&A, assuming any of you are still awake and have found any of this interesting. We experienced cyberspace in the West essentially as an electromagnetic domain. And even today, if you take a look at the controversy over the Earn IT bill that's in Congress that has bipartisan support, there are civil libertarians who say that it would allow too much government intrusion and governance in cyberspace. And there's a very healthy, in my view, debate underway about that bill and about the level of governance government would provide. For China and other countries, cyberspace is where you govern human behavior. You watch people there, you engage in persistent surveillance, you use artificial intelligence to make decisions about the value of their behavior, and you give them a good or a not so good ticket on the next plane that they want to fly or whether or not they get to travel. And they look at this as they look at cybersecurity as an ideology. Now, how is this being expressed? China is trying to build as much as possible the next generation of the world's information technology infrastructure. That is the next generation of all of the integrated computer networks that will comprise the internet of the future. And their company, Huawei, is the largest and frankly cheapest provider of this technology. They are building out a global infrastructure scheme called One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative. And along that, they want to build out a digital Silk Road equipped with their information technology. And the question is this: if they build it and these countries adopt not only China's information technology, but their ideology, what happens to the cyberspace in these countries? Or if they outsource to China the management of these infrastructures, who then becomes the sovereign in these countries? What would happen if this model were extended to our doorstep? That's an interesting question. This is a somewhat dated picture from the magazine The Economist as to where they're building One Belt, One Road. You'll notice, by the way, what it doesn't show is that there are aspects of this now in Latin America. And as you can see, they have nodes all over, all over Europe and all over Africa and all over Asia, going into Western Europe. And what goes on this digital Silk Road? Well, let me give you a picture of it. This is a smart city architecture developed by Alibaba. Again, I think they may have updated this, but let me, without making you all take an unwelcome and unexpected eye exam, let me guide you through the top line of this thing. On the left are all the places where the data comes from: imaging devices, sensor devices, network data, devices on the road looking at the number of cars, devices on trams and subways looking at speed and congestion, devices in the pipes so that you know what the water flow is, devices that tell you how many police are deployed. That data goes to the middle where it's converged, and the applications below, using machine learning to habituate it to the system to that and spot patterns in that data, and artificial intelligence to actually make decisions on that data. Those decisions are expressed in the infrastructure on the right: medical resources, administrative resources, power resources, policing resources, how many police to deploy to this part of the region or that part of the region, road resources and rail resources. Let me ask you a question. If all that data is being accrued and decisions are being made about the deployment of everything from electricity to police, neighborhood by neighborhood, who runs this city? Who's sovereign? And if this kind of infrastructure is being placed on this kind of a map, This is a different kind of cyberspace that's emerging and a different kind of cybersecurity. This, I think, is interesting. So where are we now? And I'm going to wrap up and leave us with some questions. We were initially connected in cyberspace. That's how we were. We connected. And still a lot of people look at cyberspace as a connection. Increasingly, we depend on it now. We depend on it for banking, for paying our bills, for social networks and social media, and making restaurant reservations and ordering from Grubhub. But increasingly, as we move to a world like this, and we're building smart cities in the United States and Europe too, by the way, we are not just going to depend on cyberspace. We and our infrastructures will reside there. And that means that inevitably, cybersecurity won't just be about the protection of information. It won't just be about the protection of the infrastructure. It'll be about what model of governance that we choose. Cybersecurity and these dueling models have become an aspect of great power competition, particularly between the United States and China. Great powers are using this to gain sovereignty and control over infrastructures, as well as to use Joseph Nye's third level on the chessboard to influence and undermine competitors and tell the best story. That's happening today. So for the United States, we continue to see it as this domain. For authoritarian countries, it really is about the governance of human behavior. I think we've got a little bit of time for Q&A, so I'm going to stop at this point. I can elaborate on some of these points of view, but at this point, I think I'd like to move over to Q&A. So Spaff, if you agree, I'm going to stop presenting and open this up. I see that we're already getting the first question. Spaff, are we in good shape for this?
We are. So do you want to just answer the questions that are in Q&A there?
All right, I will see. So anonymous. I read that anonymous. All right, well, you can be anonymous, although I don't know why you want to be. I read that innovators need to consider cybersecurity at the heart of their innovations. Most of the innovations created end up being introduced in other countries. However, how people choose to use technologies differs from person to person. What direction do you think we should be looking at to ensure that the negatives of technological advancements don't outweigh the good? Well, let me answer, assuming you can hear me. There is no perfect assurance that a technology will be used for good and not for ill. I go back in my mind to the years 2010, 2011, when we had the Arab Spring. And many said, aha, look at the Egyptians. They're using information technology to coordinate the crowds, to rise up in opposition to the government, to get the crowds into Tahrir Square. The government of Egypt was at the time not very agile. They barely knew that cyberspace existed. If a government minister wanted a restaurant reservation, they sent some flunky in the office over to the restaurant to make that reservation and let him know that he and his family would be there for however long they were going to be there. That's what happened. They didn't use cyberspace. But people in Egypt were using it to manage their families and their small businesses and remittances. And cyberspace was being used in electronic, essentially to coordinate the mobs that overthrew the government. And people said, well, this means that cyberspace and this technology is going to be used as a great democratizing influence. It's 2022 now. Authoritarian governments with the largest population in the world are using this same technology not to allow for a liberal democracy, but to monitor and govern the behavior of human beings. What I think this really means is that people need to make themselves literate. We buy and adopt this technology, but do we always ask ourselves, what are our responsibilities for its use? Everybody wants broadband connectivity. I do too, and I want it to be cheap. I want it to be ubiquitous, absolutely. But on the other hand, one of the things we've learned is we need to take responsibility for its use. There's an awful lot of really bad, dangerous disinformation and malinformation today, doing everything from telling us that our election system can't be trusted to taking crazy and unproven, using ivermectin to treat, an antiparasitic to treat a virus, an antiparasitic for cattle to try to treat a virus in human beings. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to become an educated and responsible populace. That I think is a very, very big deal. Another attendee has asked, how can we compromise between gathering information for national security reasons and giving our citizens privacy? In a country like China, if a country like China does not care about the privacy of their citizens, is it impossible for the US ever to gain advantage over these autocratic countries? I remain fundamentally optimistic on this point. I think the United States has had a vigorous and sometimes painful discussion about gathering information for national security and privacy. The revelations from Edward Snowden were painful, and for people like me coming out of the national security environment, I was not happy to see this. I was not pleased with him. But on the other hand, it is important for our country that we recognize that we really do have a Fourth Amendment in our Constitution. I think the level of debate about this is evidence that we probably will continue to work hard at that balance, and that balance will shift, and it should shift from time to time, right? Some days it's the day after 9/11, some days it's not. And that balance is going to shift, and that's going to be a moving target. And the fact that we have three branches of government and a couple of major political parties and lots of competing interests in this country means that it will always move. That needle is always going to move, and that's not a bad thing. And that level of debate, I think, remains active. The other reason I am frankly optimistic is that I teach as an adjunct at Georgetown. And I have the privilege of engaging in a lot of conversation with my students, and they're thoughtful about this. They are confident in the future, and they don't necessarily believe that just because a country is trying to be a monolith, that monolith is invulnerable. We looked in the Cold War at the Soviet Union and China as this communist monolith that we could never get through it. But yet, our point of view is actually really quite successful. And at least one authoritarian country right now, which believed that it could do pretty much anything it wants, and thought that the variety of opinions and interests that existed among the liberal democracies would not allow them to come together, has actually gotten rather a nasty shock. So, I think that if someone is looking for a compromise, I would say it's a dynamic compromise, and one that will always be moving and always should moving. I see there is another question. I'm writing a paper right now about how I feel data laws are lagging while smart tech is sprinting. Do I have good sources where I can research this claim and look into the current advancements being made in legislation and regulation? There are several places at which I'd look. First, you ought to take a look at the EARN IT legislation, which is pending on the Hill. It has bipartisan support. I think it also has bipartisan opposition. That's a good place to look. There's an organization that's looking at security and freedom in cyberspace called XRSI. I think some of their publications are interesting. In fact, I co-wrote a paper with them on securing the metaverse, which is a term I barely understand. So why was it? What business did I have in writing a paper? And if you want, I'll put my email address here in the chat, and I'd be happy to take your questions offline. Douglas Rapp says, it is unlikely that in the current political environment, the governments and the profit-driven industries that support them will be willing to educate the populace on digital ethics, the humane use of technology. Do you think the concept of universal ethics can be propagated via social media? Well, I think almost anything can be propagated by social media. There's evidence of that, and including some pretty, some pretty highly refined ideas and stuff that absolutely is the stuff at the bottom of the pond. I don't think it is the job of government and industry to educate people on digital ethics. I think it is the job of universities to do so. I think it is the job of nonprofits to do so. And I think it is the job of human beings to do so, to stop being lazy, to stop saying, well, I read it on Facebook, or I saw it on Twitter, or I saw a video on TikTok, so it must be true. We have an educational system that needs to double down on teaching people the scientific method and critical thinking. If you want to be educated on digital ethics or the humane use of technology, I think it's important that you redouble your own personal commitment to critical thinking, to asking, where does this information come from? What's its provenance? Why would I believe it's true? Just the fact that everybody says it doesn't necessarily make it true. What is the source? What tools do I have to evaluate the validity of the information, its veracity, and even the authenticity of its provenance? I think this is a human responsibility, not necessarily a government's responsibility. China, by the way, I think believes that it is their responsibility to teach digital ethics their way, and I think that's what they're doing. Has our society managed to adapt positively to the advent of cyberspace? Newspapers make a moderately professional source of news accessible to everyone. It seems like in our country, the ability of including the uninformed to have their voice heard is tearing us apart. That may be true. I guess I would go back to my prior answer, and that is, I think it is time not to teach people what's true, but to teach people to use the tools by which they can make these determinations. Otherwise, we will be subject to information that is untrue, and in some cases deliberately untrue, where cybersecurity will represent the malicious use of information at that third level, where the best story won't be the truest story, but it will be the one that is the most compelling. I'm going to take these last two. To what extent should access to cyberspace and technology be used in foreign policy? The US is fortunate to dominate the technology that invented cyberspace. Should we use it to advance our foreign policy objectives, such as freedom and democracy, as well as potentially lesser things? I think broadly speaking, the answer to that is yes. I don't know that we dominate it because, there are more people in China online than there are people in the United States. And there are a lot of people. Look, there are, 7.6 billion people in the world. Over half of them are online. The United States, we have a commanding role in the technology, but we're not the only ones. What I would say is that we should be vigorous in working with our allies and partners, working with other liberal democracies, working with Japan, working with the Republic of Korea, working with the countries in the EU, working throughout Africa, working in Latin America with other countries in Asia, to the extent that we can, to share our point of view and to make clear that one can have a stable democracy and a stable and healthy society without persistent surveillance and persistent governance in cyberspace. I think that's absolutely a possibility. Should we cut off our foreign adversaries like Russia and China with their access to cyberspace to let only liberal democracies have these tools? What would be the consequences of having two incompatible cyberspaces? I don't know that one can cut them off. What I would say is the state-centric view that these countries are taking to cyberspace, where they say it's not a global commons, means that they intend to be able to isolate themselves as much as they need to, impose their own rules, their own kind of governance, their own kind of surveillance. So I think the real question is, what do we do to encourage countries not to adopt a state-centric view of cyberspace and exercise cybersecurity from a state-centric view where they cut themselves off? That's my larger concern. I'm going to stop at this point because it's 5:30. I will put in chat my contact information. If there is a last question, Spaff, I would like to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. I think this is a topic we could certainly go on for quite a bit longer. And perhaps we will touch on this at another point. Some of this may come up at the CERIAS Symposium at the end of the month, and I would encourage people to consider registering for that. But thank you for speaking with us today. Thank you for being willing to answer follow-ups. People will wait for a few moments here for people to copy that down from the chat session if they wish. And perhaps we'll get to see you in person sometime in the near future.
I would very much enjoy that, Spaff, and I'd enjoy meeting with your students. And of course, it's always a pleasure to see you.
Yes, and likewise, I think for everybody who's listening in, some of the issues that have been brought up here and were brought up earlier by Professor Demchek and her talk, we should pay attention to what's going on in the news right now with the Ukraine and Russia and what various sanctions are bringing. The calls, for instance, to cut off Russia from the internet are a bad idea, actually, for some of the reasons you had, right? For communications, for personal communications. And the UN has recognized internet access as a human right. So we have some very interesting evolution to go on in this and look at some of the side effects. So with that, people by now should have copied down your address. You have other things to do, as do all of us. Please have a great evening, everyone, and we'll see you next Wednesday for the next seminar.
Beth, it's been a pleasure, and thank you all for your attention this afternoon. Take care now.
Bye-bye.